Welcome to The Rational Mind, and you're joining me today on Death and the Afterlife, which is chapter 3.2 in the OCR A-Level Religious Studies specification. So a quick recap. Christianity teaches that people have souls that can survive the death of the body, and there are divergent beliefs about life after death within Christianity, as different interpretations have been given to different ideas and teachings. So now just take a pause of this video and see whether you can define all of these key terms before I go into them. So resurrection is living on after death in a glorified physical form in a new realm. Disembodied existence is existing without a physical body. Beatific vision is a face-to-face encounter with God. Parousia is used in Christianity to refer to the second coming of Christ. Universalism is the view that all people will be saved. Purgatory is a place where people go temporarily after death to be cleansed of sin before they are fit to live with God. And this is mostly a Catholic belief, which we'll go into further. Limited election is the view that God chooses only a small number of people for heaven. An original sin is a state of wrongdoing in which people are born according to some Christians because of the sin of Adam and Eve. So firstly, more about resurrection. So Christians believe that life after death, people will have a new life in this new kind of existence. And they reject the idea that a human soul leaves one physical body and joins another in this same world. So any rebirth or reincarnation beliefs that are prominent within Buddhism or Hinduism. Because Christians don't believe that your body is, or your soul is reborn into a different body. Your body dies and your soul lives on to live within heaven, for example. And that's what Christians believe. It's still the same you, and it's only one you, rather than being reborn and going back. So instead, like I started to mention, they believe that the soul will be given a new spiritual, glorified physical body in which to continue to live after death and resurrection. And they believe that the person who lives after death is still the same person, but they will be incorruptible. So in that sense, they will be unperishable. So a really key quote you can use from the Bible is, the body will be raised perishable, but the soul will be raised imperishable. So again, just shows that the body will die and will rot and all of those kind of things once it dies, whilst the soul lives on. It will never be destroyed, in a sense. So before Jesus, the Pharisees, who were a group of Jews at the time, so within the time of Jesus there were different types of Jews, different sets of Jews, and the Pharisees were one of them. So they believed in resurrection, and it's mentioned in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. So Christians base their belief in resurrection on biblical accounts of Jesus' resurrection. And the Gospels say that after Jesus was crucified and died, his body was placed in a tomb with a heavy stone over the entrance. And on the third day, the stone had been rolled away by the tomb and was empty, and Jesus was then seen and heard by his followers as a man in a physical body. So Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene and another woman. So that can also be seen as a significant impact of why did he choose to reveal himself to two women first. Christians believe that the resurrection of Jesus demonstrates that they too will also be resurrected after death. And because of this, resurrection is a really important impact for Christians and the most important thing about Christianity, because through Jesus' death and resurrection became the possibility to join God eternally in heaven. So St. Paul also writes about life after death in his two letters to the Corinthians, and he uses metaphors to explain these beliefs. So in Corinthians, he uses the metaphor of a seed transforming into the plant it will become, so to show that the physical earthly body will be transformed to fulfill its potential. In 2 Corinthians, he uses the metaphor of a tent being replaced with a solid house to show how life in this world is temporary and will be replaced by something long-lasting, and how life after death will provide a home. And in 2 Corinthians, he also uses the metaphor of being naked in the world but clothed in the afterlife, to show that we will no longer need to be ashamed or need to feel shame. So kind of more of an Adam and Eve type thing, because before they ate the tree of life, the fruit from the tree of life, they weren't aware that they were naked or afraid, or all of these different things. It was only once they ate the fruit of the tree of life that came into being. So it's kind of going back to the state of the Garden of Eden. So all of these you can kind of use as a metaphor to illustrate resurrection, what's meant by resurrection. And again, it's just to illustrate the Bible in a lot of different Christian senses. It's used metaphorically. So now we have heaven, and as you can see, these are normally the ways that heaven is described is through a steps into heaven with a gate that opens up to people. So traditionally, Christians describe the afterlife in terms of going to heaven. And they use different symbols and analogies to describe heaven, whilst also accepting the nature of life after death remains a mystery yet to be revealed. So this is something that you could potentially criticize, is the fact that it's a mystery, because a lot of things when Christians don't know, or just religious believers when they don't know, they say it's a mystery. There's positives and negatives to that you can evaluate. So some of the symbols used about heaven is the idea of returning to a family home. So the idea of it being safe and you being surrounded by people that you love. The idea of place where there will be no more suffering. The idea of plenty or fulfilled. The idea of being surrounded by angels, and so protection, and the idea of meeting God the Father, who will be seated on the throne, and Jesus on his right hand side. And Jesus on his right hand side. So again, just showing protection, stability, comfort, all of those nice things. And there are other descriptions of heaven are not meant to be taken literally, and most Christians do not believe that heaven is literally a place, but instead a lot of Christians see it as a spiritual state, so a psychological state. So heaven is the state in which a person recognizes and accepts God's grace and is forgiven and made whole. So while hell is the opposite of that, is where someone rejects God and chooses sin. So some Christians understand heaven in terms of an eternity of endless days in which to praise God, whilst others understand it as timeless, often in terms of beatific vision described by Aquinas, which we'll walk into more. And heaven is sometimes understood as the transformation and perfection of the whole of creation, when Jesus will come to earth again, known as parousia or the second coming, which Christians are still waiting for. So the Bible gives some ideas about heaven in symbolic language and in parables, such as the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16:19-32. And if you remember, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus just illustrates a fact, well, for Christians, or it's a metaphorical fact, let's say, that Lazarus ends up going to heaven. He is a poor man. He gives everything he can. Whilst the rich man is obviously a very rich man, and he ends up going to hell because he doesn't help anyone. He uses all the money for himself. And when he's in hell, he says to God, "Can you warn my sons for them not to do the same mistakes that I did?" And God replies saying, no, they have all the tools that they need on earth. So in that sense, it's basically saying the Bible or the scriptures and all the teachings are enough to help you understand what you ought to do in order to enter heaven. So that's a really good parable to give. You can also kind of use this parable in reference to liberation theology and Marxism with that topic and link it there, because it could potentially show preferential option for the poor. So it's something you can develop there, and you can look at my video for that as well. Whilst this image here is showing you Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And this is his sisters, Mary and Martha, and they called God, Jesus, basically to say, can you help us, because he's died, and Jesus raised him. So that again just illustrates the power and significance of resurrection. The resurrection of Lazarus was the first instance of a resurrection happening in the New Testament. In the Old Testament there wasn't any. Some people argue against the idea of heaven after death, saying that it raises more questions than it answers, especially if people have resurrected physical bodies which take up space. So if these bodies are physical, then there are questions such as what and how people would eat and whether they would age. So in that instance, there's questions of, well, when you die and you're resurrected, are you resurrected the age you died? Are you resurrected the age that you want to die, or that you want to be remembered by? Would you eat? Would you not eat? Would you drink water? All of those kind of things. So there's a lot of kind of physical problems that people identify. It's difficult to see how we could be the same person in heaven if we have a different glorified body and are eternal. So some people argued that it is a mystery we cannot expect to understand in this life. So again, you can criticise that. Here we have Bernard Williams, and he criticised Christian ideas about heaven by saying that it would get boring after a while because people would run out of things to do and would not have the existing challenges of making choices about how to use a limited lifespan. So some responded by saying that being in the presence of the wonders of God would never get boring, and that God would make sure that we never felt boredom, just as we never would feel pain again. And then we have Thomas Aquinas and the beatific vision. So Aquinas, and you can remember him from natural moral law and the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. He thought that the afterlife in terms of beatific vision, in which people come face to face with God for all eternity. So he thought that the beatific vision was not in time, so he rejected the view that Christians would see the face of God day after day forever. But instead, he thought that it would be a timeless vision. So there would be no more time, but the past, the present, and future would all be brought together. And this might avoid problems of the possibility of heaven getting boring or taking up room. So this would go against or countering to what Bernard Williams would say, because you wouldn't feel past, present, future. Would you see time as everything at once? So time really wouldn't be moving for you, kind of in a transcendent way, just like God has in your attributes of God topic. So in that sense, you wouldn't feel boredom. And the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who you see to your right here, supported the view of a timeless afterlife, agreeing that the idea of endless days had too many problems. But it raises philosophical issues of its own, so such as how people might be resurrected into physical bodies for the beatific vision. So given that physical bodies exist in time, and how people could continue to be the same person as they were before death, when so many human characteristics are directly related to living within time. And now we're going to go into hell. So as you can see in the image here, hell is always depicted a lot of times by the image of fire, eternal suffering, pain. You can see kind of Lucifer or the devil depicted here. So again, there's no escape. Maybe there's an entrance, but you can't escape because you're kind of drowning in this pain. So the traditional Christian teaching presents the idea of hell as a place of eternal punishment, separated from God's presence. In the Bible, it is sometimes described in terms of fire and torture, sometimes darkness, and sometimes as a rubbish dump. It's often described as being in a downward direction from this world. And the concept of hell raises difficult issues with questions about whether hell is compatible with the idea of an omnipotent, loving, and perfectly merciful God. And Hume raised the question of whether there could be anything a human being could do that would justify eternal punishment. So he's basically saying, well, would any act on earth actually be punishable by eternal punishment? Some people would say yes, obviously, because things like Hitler's Holocaust, all of those, Nazi Germany, all of that kind of stuff is kind of saying, well, maybe he does deserve eternal punishment, as well as any Nazis or murderers, all that kind of stuff. But other people would argue that it wouldn't be sufficient. And some people argue in response that wrongdoing, God deserves infinite punishment because God is infinitely good. And the concept of hell also raises issues of whether hell would get boring after a while. But here it wouldn't be that much of an issue because that could be a form of torture, if you would use it in that way. So it could be a form of punishment if you feel boredom. And Hick, so you remember him from his eschatological verification principle, and he argued that a loving God would not allow his creatures to suffer for all eternity. He was a universalist and believing that there would eventually be salvation for all people, and that the afterlife is an opportunity to continue a spiritual journey. So again, you kind of see Hick here as a more pluralist argument that you can use from that topic. Again, you can look at that in my video for that. And some people argue that there would be no point in having eternal punishment, as it would achieve nothing, except perhaps a deterrent from sin for those who have not yet died. And this led to the argument that notions of hell were invented as a form of societal control. And again, hell and heaven and purgatory, which we'll go into, were very big in medieval times, where people used it as a form of control in a way. Especially with things like burning witches or suspected witches, because they were thought they would go to hell for all of these things. So again, it was using it as a form of social control. So here we have purgatory. And like I said, it's mostly a Catholic concept and doesn't appear explicitly in the Bible, but was developed as a concept by early Christian thinkers such as Origen and Augustine. So in the 6th century, Pope Gregory further explored the idea of a place or state where souls could be cleansed after death before they are fit to enter heaven. And he understood this from a verse from Matthew's Gospel to mean that there could be forgiveness after death. So in this sense, the idea is that you enter through the narrow gate of heaven, which is a quote that you can use from the Bible, and it suggests that there could be a narrow door in terms of only a select group of people can actually enter heaven. And then people go through this mountain of suffering through a cleansing of the soul process, because no one that dies, their soul is never clean enough to enter heaven, which is Eden. So you can kind of see what I always assume to be Adam and Eve, because they would have, obviously as the first humans, as biblically written, would have gone through this process quicker than everyone else. So in this sense, it's kind of showing that you have to work towards and be cleansed to enter and be pure enough to enter heaven. And Christians believe that if you pray Catholics believe that if you pray for the dead, then this process is sped up. No one knows how long this takes. It depends on how clean your soul was. So purgatory is traditionally understood to be a place of pain and cleansing, often symbolized by fire, where the soul recognizes its sin and is punished, but not forever. And the Catholic teaching includes the belief that the prayers of the living, like I said, can help the souls of the dead to endure the experience and to speed up. And Rayner, as you remember from before, explored the doctrine of purgatory and argued that it should be understood not as a horrible place of pain, but as a metaphor for the soul's greater awareness of the consequences of sin and of holiness of God. And Protestants usually did not believe in purgatory on the grounds that it is not an explicit biblical teaching, and in their view, the doctrine suggests that Christ's sacrifice on the cross did not bring about complete salvation. And in the Middle Ages, the practice of charging people money to pay for a shortened lifetime in purgatory, selling indulgences, let's say, was heavily criticised by Protestant reformers, because again, it was a way to exploit people, which obviously isn't a very Christian aspect. Now we have election. And election is sometimes called predestination, and it's the belief that God chooses the eternal destiny of each human soul. God knows before people are born whether or not they will go to heaven. And here you have John Calvin, who was a Calvinist who believed in predestination. So some Christians argue that because God is omniscient, he must know what will happen to each person before they are born. Because God is omnipotent, it must be in God's control to choose what happens to people. And this you can use in the context of heaven to say, well, people like Calvin would believe that people are already predestined whether they go to heaven or hell or not. And just because you're Catholic or Christian or whatever doesn't mean you'll necessarily go to heaven. So he narrows the door to heaven even more. And again, you can use this as a very select sense of exclusivist views. And again, you can incorporate some of those topics from that module into this here. Again, see my video on exclusivism there. Augustine and others thought a doctrine of limited election, claiming that God would save some people through grace, but only a limited number. And Augustine argued that no one could deserve salvation because of the original sin. And Augustine thought that election was a sign of God's grace and evidence of God's great love. Whilst Calvin thought that God chose some people for eternal life in heaven and some for eternal punishment. The idea of election is controversial and not accepted by all Christians. So, for example, Karl Barth taught a doctrine of unlimited election, saying that Jesus brought salvation for the whole world and anyone who accepted the Christian message could be saved. So he's giving more of an inclusivist approach here, saying that's anyone with the Christian message. So it doesn't mean that you have to be a Christian, it's just you have to adapt the Christian message and live towards the Christian message, and that will help you become saved. So again, not fully acceptable of everything, but an inclusivist approach here. And 20th century theologian Hick went further and taught that everyone will be saved eventually. So again, a pluralist account, whether they're Christian or not. So everyone will continue their spiritual journey after death, and an all-loving God will ensure that everyone is saved. And Hick's view has been criticised, for example, by Pope Benedict XVI, who said that if everyone is saved regardless of their faith, then Christ's death seems pointless. But a way to counter that is saying, well, no, it's just another way to gain salvation. And now on to judgment. So Christians share the view that after death, there will be some kind of judgment from God. And the question of whether each person is judged at the point of death or whether there is judgment day for everyone at the end of time does not have a clear answer in Christianity, and the Bible can be used to support a different number of possibilities. So the first idea is that some people, such as prophets and saints, might have a kind of a fast track to heaven, while the rest have to wait until the time of God's choosing when their world ends. The second idea is that everyone has to wait until the death of time for Judgment Day. And idea 3 is that each person goes to heaven or hell as soon as they die, and others join them as they die. So this is mostly what Christians believe. And if you remember, you've got the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew. So this story is told by Jesus, and it describes what will happen when the Son of Man comes in his glory. And Christians interpret this to be a reference to Jesus himself. So it describes judgment when people are separated in the same way that shepherds separate sheep from goats. Some people are sent to heaven, and some people are sent to hell, and eternal punishment. And there is no middle state. So this doesn't include purgatory. But in this way, you can see that the sheep are inferred to go to heaven because they are following the shepherd, as Jesus is often called the shepherd. So in that sense, it's basically saying if you follow the teachings of Jesus, then you will go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell. So those who go to heaven are chosen because of the way they have treated others when they are in need, and those who go to punishment are sent because they have ignored those in need. So doing something for people in need is seen as doing something for Jesus himself. So a good quote you can give here is, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, which is, you can use, it goes on for a bit longer, the quote, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, I was naked and you clothed me. That's a quote that for a parable that Jesus used, and is a really good one to give in the sense of someone's in need, you help them, and that you get rewarded for. But your intention obviously can't be, I want to get rewarded. It has to be pure, and you have to want to help. And the parable says that God has prepared a place for those who go to heaven, suggesting God knew they would be coming as well. So that's all your knowledge for this topic. Now test your knowledge with these questions, and if you can answer them all, then you know all the AO1 for this topic. Now it's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. So firstly, we have this question: how persuasive is the view that God's judgment takes place immediately after death? So within this essay, you would do your introduction, and then you might demonstrate some knowledge and understanding through the use of your following ideas. So obviously what I'm about to say isn't only what you can say, it's just some ideas to help you frame this. So describe and explain the concepts of sin and God's judgment. Describe and explain the distinction drawn between some scholars between a particular judgment and final judgment, and of biblical passages which might support each view or which are ambiguous. Then we might go into arguments that show more critical evaluation, analysis, and coherent argument through the use of some of the following. So again, not exclusive to this. You can add other points if you see them fitting. But you might want to argue that individuals at the moment of death is persuasive by using these. So some biblical passages suggest that people go to heaven and therefore must have been judged. So as soon as they die. So examples to support this that you could use is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, or Jesus' words to the robber on the cross. The Christian message often supports the idea that the dead are already in heaven, with the wrong wording of Christian funerals echoing this. The idea of the living paying or praying for souls in purgatory could support the idea that souls are judged immediately after death. Otherwise, people who died a long time ago would have spent a lot longer in purgatory before the final judgment. It could also be argued that there is both individual judgment immediately after death and also a final judgment when the world comes to the end with a parousia, so the second coming of Jesus. And these ideas assume that the Bible and the church tradition are authoritative. Then you might want to go into arguments going against this, so not persuasive. So ideas about life after death in general are not persuasive for reasons of lack of empirical evidence, although you can then counter this with Hick's eschatological verification from the religious language 20th century perspectives, with his parable of the celestial city, because it shows empirical verification when we die. You might also want to talk about a logical positive perspective, so ideas about life after death being meaningless. So again, linking to religious language here. Biblical teachings about God coming in final judgment, such as the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, could be used to support the view that final judgment is more persuasive. And biblical teachings about God's judgment is too ambiguous to give a clear picture. And then you can end with your conclusion. Remember also to give your strengths and weaknesses of both arguments or both sides. Then you can practice this one. Purgatory is a state through which everyone goes. So again, start with your introduction, introducing your key words. And then you have to demonstrate knowledge and understanding through the use of the following ideas. Again, it's not only exclusive to this. If you have other ideas, do add that. So firstly, describe and explain the origins of Catholic teaching about purgatory. It's developed by thinkers such as Origen and Augustine based on Matthew 12 and the idea of forgiveness in the age to come. Describe and explain how purgatory could be understood as a place of cleansing of souls, including imagery of fire. You can describe and explain alternative views of purgatory, such as metaphorical understanding, with reference to thinkers such as Karl Rahner. And describe and explain Protestant and other objections to the doctrine of purgatory. For example, that it's not an idea that has prominence in the Bible, and that Protestant reformers objected to the presence of indulgences. And then you could go into your critical evaluation in support of purgatory. So Catholic teaching would suggest that all souls need cleansing before they are fit to come into the presence of God. you can give the medieval example here. A universalist understanding of salvation could be used to support the view that everyone eventually goes to heaven. Hick's view of life after death might be seen as persuasive, with people carrying on their spiritual journeys and learning lessons in the new life before reaching their destination. And then you might have some arguments that might disagree that purgatory is a state through which everyone goes to. And you can use these arguments. So some people, according to mainstream Catholic and Protestant teaching, go to hell rather than purgatory. So maybe not everyone goes to purgatory. Or is a state of eternal cleansing hell itself? Because it might take you way longer. You might spend eternity cleansing your soul. We don't know whether that's also a possibility. Augustine, Calvin, and others argued that only some people are elected for heaven, so you can talk about those predestination arguments, and this could be more persuasive, or you can challenge those with the views we talked about. The Protestant view is usually that purgatory is not a biblical concept, so if everyone goes through purgatory, God would have revealed this in the Bible. Or is it used metaphorically as mentioned in Matthew? It's up to you to decide. Life after death as a concept is unconvincing is another point you can make, as life and death are mutually exclusive states with reference to flu and or others, so you can talk about falsification here if you wanted to. Or you can even go into an exclusivist approach, saying it's too exclusive, it doesn't include all religions. Buddhists, for example, don't believe in hell or heaven or purgatory. And the idea that religious language of life after death is meaningless as it's not empirically verifiable or falsifiable. But again, you can use Hick's argument there to criticise that. And then you would go into your conclusion on this to see what arguments you think are the most convincing. So thank you so much for joining me for this presentation, and join me next time for more religious studies, philosophy and ethics.